Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for having me. I know, well, actually, I'm not quite between you and the drinks, but hopefully I've got enough to keep you interested. I do feel a little bit of imposter syndrome compared to some of the other speakers. I'm not a doctor, I'm not a professor, but hopefully I can share my experience from the last 25 years of working. As you've just heard, I work for a consultancy. We're really small. We're headquartered in Frome, which is a small town in the West Country, so quite a random place to be headquartered. But actually, we work with some of the world's biggest companies, and it's particularly on human rights and sustainable business. And much of that is about, and it's changing actually. So up until recently, the focus of all these companies has been about human rights in their supply chains. So very much I'll be able to talk to you about that experience. But actually, they're all having to start to think about human rights within their customer base and within their own operations. And I actually think when you're starting to think about technology, that whole piece around human rights for customers is really interesting. But I'm not particularly going to talk about that today, but I just thought it was worth flagging. Again, you've heard a bit about me. I started out in purchasing for Sainsbury's, worked 5 years there as a graduate, learning all the ropes about being a buyer, very lucky to travel. And then I worked for a very small startup, .com, not-for-profit, which was all about understanding social issues in supply chains. So I worked there for 2 years. I was its second employee. It now has 150, so it absolutely scaled. But from that, again, I sort of learned quite a lot about technology, starting up something that was promised to solve all the world's solutions in terms of ethical and social business. And I'll talk to you a bit about whether I think that succeeded or not. And then I spent 14 years at Marks & Spencer, and that was all about their social sustainability sourcing strategy. So I mainly worked in food, but I did also quite a lot of work in the clothing and homeware supply chains. And really, I spent a lot of time working with their suppliers, meeting them, and particularly focused around the workers who make and grow the products that you probably, well, I'm sure you all buy, eat, and enjoy. So very lucky, really, to have experienced that and really seen firsthand supply chains from the beginning of the chain. The title of the talk is about resilience. And really, what does that mean when it comes to supply chains? It's that whole piece around being able to weather shocks and be able to get through any changes that happen, whether they're short-term or long-term. And you have to say that in the last 5 years, there have been plenty of those. So if you worked, I was working at Marks & Spencer's when COVID hit, the change that brought on the business and the changes in behaviours and systems that they had to put in place at, days' notice was absolutely astounding. But likewise, the war in Ukraine, climate change, the Suez Canal, all of those things have absolutely fundamentally challenged supply chains. And I was with a CPO of a FMCG healthcare business about 2 weeks ago, and he said he'd spent his whole career globalizing supply chains, but the strategy is now reversed, and it's all about how you localize them. And he said he finds it really quite a paradox that he's spent all of his time doing that. And I think that's something, again, really interesting to see how businesses are having to change. And they've moved from abundance, really, to shortage. And so probably 15 years ago, if you were in procurement, you could, put your tenders out, you could lower the cost, keep pushing and pushing and pushing it down. That isn't the same now. And it's there is still competition, I'm not denying that, but it's much more about relationships and knowing who you're supplying from and offering, wanting to be the customer of choice. So it is actually starting to change, which when you get to what I do, is I see as very much as a good thing. In preparation for this, because actually my day job is I am actually spending time working with companies, helping them prepare for human rights legislation, for example. So the EU are bringing in a raft of legislation for companies, which is to show that they're respecting human rights due diligence, they're respecting sustainability, they're not buying from companies that may be committing forced labour or companies that are deforesting. So that's what I do as a day job. But through that, technology underpins all of it. And so I started to have a think about which which technologies am I seeing, which are making a difference. And certainly when I worked at Marks and Spencer's, I think I probably got 2 or 3 requests a day or emails a day with companies telling me how the new technology they were developing was going to solve my life and make all my problems go away. So I sort of had a bit of a look to see, what was out there, and found some of these headlines. And the big one is always about blockchain. It's going to transform everything. And some of these headlines are from 2012. Some of them are from 2017. And admittedly, the pandemic has got in the way, but I'm not seeing any sign that blockchain is completely transforming supply chains. And I'll probably be very controversial there, but it's certainly making a difference. It's certainly allowing more traceability and transparency, but I'll talk about that in a minute. But I think it is really interesting that if you're working in some of these big corporates, actually being able to weed through all of the offers, all of the sales pitches, to look at which technology works and which is going to make a difference is really, really hard. And actually, often companies will spend a lot of money on something new and shiny for it to fail. And so I actually, and that's my feeling, I've been involved in a lot of technology projects that never quite deliver what they promised. And I thought there was a conference, I think, that Ernst & Young had hosted in March this year, and one of their directors said that 70% of supply chain efforts fail, and actually that's my feeling actually, and again being controversial, that is sort of why are they not quite working? Why are they not quite doing what they said they would deliver? And so I thought I'd have a quick look at some of the technologies that I've been involved in, and many of them have done good things. So I don't want to say that they are absolutely, they all have a purpose and they are all useful, but are they transforming supply chains? I'm not so sure. So, for example, in the area I work in of social sustainability, companies tend to rely on audits to find out what their suppliers are doing and are they behaving and is anything wrong. People aren't trusting audits now, so technology is starting to come along, and people are saying, let's use these worker voice tools, which are surveys on phones and things like that. So that's the new hot topic. They seem quite clever, apart from often the workers don't trust what people are going to do with the information. If you're in clothing, they have to fill out a survey for one company and then another, and nothing changes. So they stop wanting to fill them out. So I think that's one example of something that's got the right purpose. It wants to do the right thing, but it's not quite hitting the mark. Likewise, in the bottom corner, surveillance. Some companies are putting in surveillance to try and stop bullying. To be able to spot if supervisors might be shouting, might be treating people badly. It's also a way to stop, check that working hours are there. But the impact that that's having on people's privacy is huge. People saying, I don't want to go to work if I'm being videos, which, we completely would understand. All of us would understand that. And then linked to that, the farmer data, there's some very impressive tools now. So if you're working with smallholder farmers, the big issue for them is about earning a living income, because actually most smallholder farmers, are living below the poverty line. The ingredient, whether it's tea, coffee, cocoa, what they're growing, they are not growing enough to live on. And so big companies are starting to ask them to sort of fill out yield information, information about how many people are working on the farm, what chemicals they're using, pesticides. And again, that's giving them a lot of information, which in theory is powerful. But again, it's taking a lot of personal information. And there's some people that believe that actually it's too much information because it's just giving more power to big companies. And whether they do the right thing with that information, it depends what side you're on or what you believe. But there's lots of people that are quite worried about the invasion of privacy there. I mentioned the small company I started to work for, SEDEX. They are an internet database that enables you to collect ethical, social data about your suppliers. I think there must be about 200,000 factories around the world on there. Again, it's supposed to be there to cut down on auditing and requests for information. And there are hundreds of these tools. So there's just a few. And again, they're intended to cut down duplication, to get more information, to get information about how workers are being treated, to enable businesses to track carbon emissions. They are trying to do the right thing, but what seems to be happening is there's just a duplication of these tools, all offering something slightly different. So if you're a factory or a business, again, you are still having to fill out all of this information, and they're not quite there, hitting the point. And then my final one is on blockchain, which I'd mentioned. Actually, this is the one that promises so much, and I have seen some really good examples of blockchain being used, but it only works if you know who you're buying from and if you know your supply chain. It's not going to, and there are so many companies that are still purchasing off a spreadsheet or off a database of suppliers of such and such a widget. They've not got a clue, maybe beyond tier 1, who is manufacturing their products. And blockchain won't solve that. It doesn't just magically tell you who your supply chain is. You still have to do the work to ask the questions and get people to keep, have the relationships and start to develop an understanding of who you're buying from. So it absolutely has a place, but it can't replace that face-to-face conversation and dialogue and trust. So I think all of these pieces, I think what I wanted to say is all of these have an absolute place in supply chain and business, and they're all really useful, but they have to be used in the right way, and they have to go alongside proper conversation and proper dialogue. Now, I am optimistic, however, about the role of technology. So one really good example, which I haven't put up here, is supply chain mapping in terms of deforestation. So actually, what you're starting to see, because of the EU legislation that's coming in on deforestation, companies are having to put a lot of money in to map their supply chains and be able to show that they are not supplying or using products from deforestation areas. And that is starting to show some real results, because once you know where you're buying from, you cannot deny your involvement. And that's what's happened up until recently. Companies are able to say, well, it might be in our supply chain, but we're not sure. That is no longer an excuse. So again, all of the legislation is starting to say it's not an excuse to say that you don't know where you're buying from. And if you do find it, you are expected to remedy it. So I hope that actually in the next few years, we will see some acceleration and better examples of this working at scale. And actually some, the mass duplication might slim down to get some really effective tools. But really my conclusion, and I've said it before, it is all still about relationships, and it's still all about trust, and it's still about dialogue. So you can't have any of this working without that. So hopefully that is and I've saved you some time. Thank you very much.